March 17, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The air hung thick and sweet, heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and something else, something unfamiliar and almost suffocating in its richness. Hauptfeldwebel Greta Zimmerman stepped off the transport truck, her legs unsteady after 3 weeks at sea and 2 days on American trains. The Louisiana sun pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight, so different from the pale, watery light of Berlin. She blinked against the brightness, her eyes struggling to adjust after years of living in carefully maintained darkness. The camp stretched before her, rows of wooden barracks painted a cheerful white that seemed almost obscene in its visibility. No camouflage, no attempt to hide from enemy aircraft. The Americans built their prisoner camps as if they had nothing to fear from the sky. Greta's throat tightened. She had spent 4 years as a communications officer in the Wehrmacht, coordinating radio transmissions in underground bunkers where even a sliver of light escaping could mean death from above. She had learned to navigate by touch, to read messages by the glow of a single shielded candle, to live like a creature adapted to perpetual twilight. And now she stood here, a prisoner, squinting in the merciless afternoon sun of a country that seemed to have forgotten what darkness meant. A young American guard, barely old enough to shave, gestured for her to follow. He smiled, actually smiled, as if escorting enemy soldiers was a pleasant afternoon duty. Greta's stomach churned. She had been briefed, of course, on what to expect. Interrogation, isolation, perhaps violence, though the Geneva Conventions supposedly prevented that. She steeled herself, straightening her spine despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel hollow. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity expected of a German officer. Even in defeat, even in this strange, bright place that smelled of flowers and freshly cut grass instead of rubble and smoke. The guard led her past rows of barracks, past groups of male prisoners working in gardens, actually gardens, tending vegetables in neat rows. Some of them looked up as she passed, their faces gaunt but not starving, their clothes worn but clean. One man was laughing at something his companion had said. Laughing. Greta felt a spike of anger. How dare they? How dare they find anything amusing while Germany lay in ruins? But beneath the anger, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously close to envy. They stopped at a smaller building, set slightly apart from the others. The guard opened the door and gestured inside. Women's voices drifted out, speaking German in the soft, exhausted tones of people who had stopped expecting anything good. Greta stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft click, not a slam, not locked, just closed. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and for a moment Greta felt a wash of relief. This was familiar. This was manageable. Darkness she understood. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized it wasn't actually dark at all. Afternoon sunlight streamed through windows, real glass windows without blackout curtains, casting rectangles of gold across a wooden floor. The barracks was long and narrow, lined with metal frame beds, perhaps 20 on each side. Other women occupied some of them, sitting or lying down, watching her with the wary curiosity of people who had learned not to expect much from newcomers. An older woman with gray-streaked hair approached. Her uniform marked her as former Luftwaffe, probably administrative. Oberst Helene Richter, Greta guessed from the insignia still visible on her collar. "You're the communications officer from Berlin," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Richter. Welcome to the strangest prison you'll ever experience." Greta nodded, unsure how to respond. Richter's tone held something she couldn't quite identify, not quite bitterness, not quite humor, something in between. Your bunk is there, Richter continued, pointing to a bed near the middle of the room. Mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow. The latrine is at the end of the building. Meals are 3 times a day in the dining hall, and yes, before you ask, there's actual food. Not much by American standards, apparently, but more than any of us have seen in years. Greta walked to her assigned bed, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. The mattress was thin but looked clean. The blankets were wool, rough but intact, without the holes and patches she'd grown accustomed to. She sat down slowly, feeling the give of the springs beneath her. For 3 years she'd slept on a cot in a bunker when she slept at all. Before that, in a boarding house in Berlin where the mattress had been stuffed with newspaper after the real filling had been requisitioned. This was luxury. This was impossible. And then she saw it, a small metal fixture on the wall beside her bed. A switch, and above it, mounted on the wall, a light bulb in a simple ceramic socket. Greta stared at it, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and touched the switch. It was cool and smooth under her fingertip. She pressed it. Click. The bulb flared to life, casting a warm yellow glow over her bed. Not bright, perhaps 60 watts, but steady and clean and impossibly wasteful. Greta's breath caught in her chest. She flicked the switch again. Click, darkness, click, light, click, darkness, click, light. It's real, Richter said from behind her, her voice soft. We all did that when we first arrived. Some of the girls spent an hour just turning them on and off. The Americans don't seem to care. There's a switch for every bed. You can read at night if you want. They have a library cart that comes around twice a week. Greta's hand fell away from the switch, leaving the light on. She stared at the bulb, watching the filament glow orange-white inside the glass. When was the last time she had seen electric light used so casually? 1940. 1941. Before the British bombing raids had intensified, before every watt of electricity had been rationed and controlled, before darkness had become not just a precaution but a way of life. She remembered the orders that had come down in 1942. All non-essential lighting prohibited after sunset. Blackout curtains mandatory in every building. Violators subject to fines or imprisonment. She remembered the special permits required for even the smallest electric torch, the careful hoarding of candles, the way her eyes had ached from years of reading by insufficient light. She remembered the bombing raid in January of 1944, when a family 3 streets from her mother's apartment had been killed because someone had struck a match near a window. Just a match, just for a moment. But enough for the British bombers to see, enough to bring death screaming down from the sky. And now here in an enemy prison camp she could have light whenever she wanted. Personal light, controllable light. Light that nobody would punish her for using. The absurdity of it made her head spin. Greta became aware that other women were watching her. A young woman, barely 20, sat on the next bed over. Her uniform marked her as former Wehrmacht, probably a clerk or typist. Her face was thin, her eyes too large, but she was smiling slightly. I cried for an hour when I figured out the switches worked, the young woman said. I'm Liesel, from Hamburg. The guards thought I'd gone mad. One of them brought me water and asked if I was ill. I couldn't explain. How do you explain crying over a light bulb? How do you make them understand what it means? Greta nodded slowly. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up tight. That first night, Greta lay in her bunk, staring up at the ceiling. Around her, the barracks settled into evening routines. Women washed at the sinks in the latrine, their voices echoing off tile. Someone hummed a tune, something from before the war, something that sounded like hope. The windows showed deepening twilight, that soft purple hour between day and night. And as the natural light faded, Greta reached up and flicked her switch. The bulb came to life immediately, casting its warm glow over her small space. She pulled one of the blankets around her shoulders, not because she was cold. The Louisiana evening was warm and humid, but because she needed something to hold on to. Then she reached into her small bag of personal effects and pulled out a book. It was a battered copy of Goethe's poetry, the only thing besides her identification papers and a single photograph that the Americans had let her keep. She'd carried it through the last year of the war, but she hadn't been able to read it. Not really. Not in the darkness of the bunker, where light was rationed and precious. Not on the transport ship, where prisoners were kept below deck in near-total darkness. Not on the train, where the windows had been covered. But now here, she opened the book and tilted it toward the light. The words sprang clear and sharp on the page. She could read without squinting, without straining, without fear. Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them back angrily. This was ridiculous. She was crying over a light bulb, just like Liesel had said. She was a German officer, a professional, someone who had coordinated communications for an entire regiment. She had survived bombing raids and evacuations, and the collapse of everything she'd believed in. She would not break down over something as simple as electric light. But the tears came anyway, hot and bitter, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the pages of her book. Because it wasn't simple. It wasn't simple at all. For 5 years she had lived in darkness. Not just physical darkness, though that had been real enough, but the darkness of rationing, of sacrifice, of being told that every comfort, every small pleasure, every basic human need had to be surrendered for the war effort. For victory, for the fatherland. She had believed it or tried to. She had accepted the cold and the hunger and the darkness because she'd been told it was necessary, because everyone was suffering together, because the alternative was defeat. And now here, in an enemy prison camp, she had more light than she'd had in her own country. More comfort, more basic human dignity. The Americans were feeding her 3 meals a day. The Americans had given her a mattress and blankets. The Americans had given her a light switch beside her bed and told her she could use it whenever she wanted. What did that mean? What did it say about the nation she had served? Greta pressed her face into the blanket, muffling her sobs. Around her the barracks had grown quiet. Some women were already asleep. Others read by their own lights, small pools of illumination in the gathering dark. No one commented on her crying. Perhaps they understood. Perhaps they had all done the same thing, in their own time, in their own way. The next morning, Greta woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz mixture of roasted grain and chicory that had passed for coffee in Germany for the past 3 years. The scent was so strong, so rich, that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. But no, she was awake, lying in a bunk in a Louisiana prison camp, and somewhere nearby, someone was brewing actual coffee. Breakfast was served in a long dining hall, women on one side, men on the other, separated by a row of tables where guards sat watching. Greta joined the line, her stomach tight with anxiety. She'd been hungry for so long that the idea of regular meals seemed like a trap. Surely they would run out. Surely the rations would be cut. Surely this abundance couldn't last. But the American cook, a heavy-set woman with flour on her apron, ladled oatmeal into Greta's bowl without hesitation. A thick, generous portion, steaming hot. Then a slice of bread, actual wheat bread, not the dark, heavy stuff made from potato flour and sawdust that had been standard in Berlin. Then a cup of coffee, black and bitter and perfect. Greta carried her tray to a table and sat down. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. The oatmeal was plain, unsweetened, but it was hot and filling, and there was enough of it. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down like a starving animal. Around her, other women did the same, their faces showing the same mixture of disbelief and cautious gratitude. "This is what they feed their prisoners," Liesel said, sitting down beside her. "Can you imagine what they feed their own people? What their soldiers eat?" Greta couldn't imagine, didn't want to imagine. It was too much, too overwhelming. She finished her oatmeal and sat back, her stomach fuller than it had been in months. The coffee was still hot in her cup. She sipped it slowly, savoring the bitterness, the warmth, the simple fact of it. That evening, after a day spent in orientation, learning the camp rules and routines, Greta returned to her bunk exhausted. She had been assigned to light work in the camp laundry, which seemed almost insulting in its ease. No 12-hour shifts in underground bunkers. No frantic coordination of radio traffic while bombs fell overhead. Just washing and folding clothes, with breaks for water and lunch. She lay down on her bunk and reached for her book, but she was tired, too tired to read. Her eyes felt heavy. She should turn off the light and sleep, but she didn't. She left it on, that small bulb glowing warm and steady above her head. She lay there, watching the light, feeling its presence like a physical thing. Around her, other women made their own choices. Some turned their lights off immediately, perhaps from habit, perhaps from some lingering sense that using electricity was wasteful or dangerous. Others left them on, reading or writing letters or simply lying there like Greta, soaking in the impossible luxury of it. Hours passed. The barracks grew quiet. Greta drifted in and out of sleep, never quite fully under, always aware of the light above her. It was past midnight when she heard footsteps, heavy boots on the wooden floor, a guard making rounds. Greta's heart jumped. She'd left the light on. She'd wasted electricity. She'd violated some rule she didn't know about. She lay frozen, waiting for the shout, the punishment, the consequences. The footsteps stopped beside her bunk. Greta forced herself to open her eyes. The guard was young, maybe 30, with a kind face and tired eyes. He looked down at her, then up at the light. "Ma'am," he said softly, trying not to wake the others, "you might want to turn that off. Bulbs don't last forever, and it's easier on everyone if we don't have to replace them too often. But it's your choice. Just thought I'd mention it." He smiled, a small, gentle smile, and moved on. That was it. No anger, no punishment, just a polite suggestion. Just a reminder that resources, even in this land of impossible abundance, had limits. But still her choice, her choice. Greta reached up with a shaking hand and flicked the switch. Darkness flooded in, but it was different now. It was chosen darkness, temporary darkness. Darkness she could end whenever she wanted with a simple movement of her finger. And that made all the difference. She rolled onto her side and pressed her face into the pillow, and this time when she cried, it was for everything. For the years of darkness and cold and hunger. For the lies she'd been told about sacrifice and necessity. For the casual cruelty of a system that had stripped away basic human comforts and called it patriotism. For the kindness of an enemy guard who had given her a choice about a light bulb. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty and exhausted. And then, finally, she slept. The weeks that followed brought more revelations, each one small in itself, but together forming a picture that Greta struggled to accept. The camp library had books in German, hundreds of them, donated by American citizens who wanted the prisoners to have something to read. The showers had hot water, not always, but several times a week, more than Greta had experienced in years. The camp had a small infirmary where a real doctor, treated prisoners for everything from colds to injuries, without charge, without questions, without punishment. And the lights, always the lights. In the dining hall, bright fluorescent tubes that made everything visible, that let you see what you were eating. In the latrines, bulbs that came on with a pull chain that worked every time, that nobody rationed or controlled. In the recreation room, where prisoners could gather in the evenings, overhead lights that stayed on until 10 o'clock, letting women talk and play cards and pretend, for a few hours, that they were something other than defeated enemies in a foreign land. Greta found herself obsessed with the lights. She would lie in her bunk at night, her own light off now. She'd learned to conserve the bulbs without being told, and watch the patterns they made. Some women left theirs on all night, perhaps afraid of the dark after years of forced blackouts. Others turned them off immediately, perhaps from ingrained habit. Still others, like Greta, used them for an hour or two, reading or writing, before switching them off and surrendering to sleep. It was a choice. That was the thing that kept circling through her mind. It was a choice that each woman made for herself, without permission, without fear, without consequence beyond a polite reminder about bulb conservation. In Germany, in the Germany she had served, there had been no choices. Not about light, not about food, not about anything that mattered. Everything had been controlled, rationed, dictated from above, and they had been told it was necessary. They had been told it was for the greater good. They had been told that sacrifice was noble, that suffering was patriotic, that darkness was a small price to pay for victory. But here, in this prison camp, in this enemy country, there was light. Abundant, casual, taken for granted light. And if the Americans could give light to their prisoners, what did that say about the darkness Germany had imposed on its own people? One evening in late April, Greta sat in the recreation room with Liesel and a few other women. Someone had found a deck of cards and they were playing a simple game, nothing serious, just something to pass the time. The overhead lights hummed softly, a sound Greta had learned to find comforting. Outside, the Louisiana evening was warm and alive with the sound of crickets and frogs. Through the windows, Greta could see the camp's perimeter lights, bright spots in the darkness, marking the boundaries of their confinement. But even those lights seemed less like prison bars and more like beacons. Like proof that someone somewhere had enough electricity to waste it on keeping prisoners safe. "Do you think about going back?" Liesel asked suddenly. "To Germany, I mean, when the war ends, when they let us go." Greta looked down at her cards. She'd been thinking about it constantly, but she hadn't found any answers. What was there to go back to? The reports that filtered through the camp spoke of devastation. Berlin in ruins. Hamburg destroyed. Whole cities reduced to rubble. And even if the buildings could be rebuilt, even if the physical damage could be repaired, what about the other damage? The damage to trust, to belief, to the basic assumption that your government wanted what was best for you. "I don't know," Greta said finally. "I don't know what's left." Liesel nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My brother wrote to me. He's in a camp in Texas. He said the Americans gave them seeds and let them plant a garden. Vegetables for themselves, not for the war effort, not for rations, just for them. He said he'd forgotten that was possible, growing food just to eat it. Not to surrender it or ration it or justify it, just to eat it." Greta felt her throat tighten again. She'd thought she was done crying, but apparently not. "How did we get here?" she whispered. "How did we become people who forgot that growing food to eat it was possible? How did we become people who lived in darkness and called it normal?" Nobody answered. There was no answer. Or rather, there were too many answers, all of them complicated and painful and impossible to face. The game continued, but the mood had shifted. The cards felt heavy in Greta's hands. She played mechanically, her mind elsewhere, circling around the same questions that had haunted her since that first night, since that first moment when she'd flicked the switch and seen the light come on. That night, back in her bunk, Greta lay awake long after lights out. Most of the bulbs in the barracks were off now, just a few scattered pools of light where women read or wrote letters home. The darkness between them felt gentle, not oppressive. Chosen darkness, temporary darkness. She thought about the guard who had reminded her about conserving bulbs. She thought about his kindness, his gentleness, his assumption that she was a person worthy of choice and consideration. She thought about the American cook who ladled out generous portions of oatmeal. She thought about the doctor who had treated her infected finger without question or judgment. She thought about the librarian who had helped her find books in German. All of them treating her, a defeated enemy, with more basic human dignity than her own government had shown its citizens. It was too much. It was too big. It broke something inside her, something that had been cracking for years but had finally shattered completely. She had served the Reich faithfully. She had believed in duty and sacrifice and the greater good. She had accepted the darkness and the hunger and the cold because she'd been told it was necessary, and it had all been a lie. Not the war itself, perhaps, not the reasons for fighting, though even those seemed murkier now, but the darkness, the rationing, the stripping away of every basic comfort and calling it patriotism, that had been a lie. Because here, in this enemy country, even prisoners had light switches beside their beds. Even prisoners had choices. Even prisoners were treated like human beings worthy of basic dignity. Greta reached up and flicked her switch. The light came on, warm and steady. She stared at it, this simple thing, this impossible luxury, and she understood, finally, what it meant. It meant that everything she'd been told about sacrifice and necessity had been a lie. It meant that the darkness had been a choice, not an inevitability. It meant that her own nation had stripped away basic human comforts not because it had to, but because it could. Because keeping people in darkness, keeping them hungry and cold and desperate, made them easier to control. The light blurred through her tears. Greta let them fall, not bothering to wipe them away. She cried for the girl she'd been in 1940, eager and patriotic and ready to serve. She cried for the years she'd lost to darkness and lies. She cried for her mother, still in Berlin if she was alive at all, still living without light, still believing the lies because what else could she do? And she cried for the future, uncertain and frightening and impossible to predict. Because how did you go back after this? How did you return to darkness after you'd seen the light? How did you accept rationing and control after you'd been given choice? She didn't know. She couldn't know. All she could do was lie here in this bunk, in this prison camp, in this enemy country, and stare at the light above her head. This simple, impossible, revolutionary light. Outside, the Louisiana night sang with insects and frogs. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, long and mournful. The camp's perimeter lights glowed steady and bright, marking boundaries, but also providing safety, visibility, proof that even in wartime, even with enemies to guard, the Americans had enough electricity to waste it on keeping people safe. Greta reached up and flicked the switch, darkness. Then, after a moment, she flicked it again, light. She could do this whenever she wanted, as many times as she wanted. Nobody would stop her. Nobody would punish her. Nobody would tell her she was wasting resources or being unpatriotic or failing in her duty. It was her choice. just hers. And that, more than anything else, more than the food or the hot water or the medical care, that was what broke her. That was what showed her how completely and thoroughly her own nation had failed its people. Because even prisoners deserved choices. Even enemies deserved basic human dignity. Even in defeat, even in confinement, even in darkness, people deserved the simple freedom to turn on a light and read a book. Germany had forgotten that, or perhaps had never known it. Had built an entire system on the assumption that people were resources to be managed, controlled, rationed, and used up in service of the state. And now Greta lay here, a prisoner of war, with more freedom and dignity than she'd had as a loyal citizen of the Reich. The irony was almost funny. Almost. She left the light on for another hour, reading her Goethe, letting the words wash over her. Poetry about beauty and truth and the human spirit. Words written in a Germany that seemed impossibly distant now, impossibly innocent. A Germany before darkness had become a way of life. Finally, exhausted, she reached up and turned off the light. But this time the darkness didn't frighten her, because she knew with absolute certainty that she could turn the light back on whenever she wanted. That knowledge, that simple freedom, was worth more than victory, worth more than patriotism, worth more than any lie she'd been told about sacrifice and duty. It was worth everything. And as Greta drifted off to sleep, in the warm Louisiana night, in the quiet barracks, surrounded by other women who had learned the same hard lessons, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but something close, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. The war would end. She would go home, or try to. She would face whatever came next. But she would never forget this. Never forget the night she cried over a light switch. Never forget what it taught her about freedom and dignity, and the basic human need for choice. Never forget that even in darkness, even in defeat, even in the deepest despair, there was always the possibility of light. All you had to do was reach up and flip the switch. The rest, the hard part, was learning to believe you deserved it. That lesson, Greta suspected, would take much longer than the war. But here, in this impossible place, in this enemy prison that felt more like home than home had felt in years, she had at least made a start. The light above her bed was off now, but she could still see it in her mind. Glowing warm and steady, waiting for her choice, always waiting, always there, always possible, and that in the end was everything.